Those protests in China over strict COVID restrictions. Watching it all very closely is China Tonight host Stan Grant, and he joins us now from Sydney. Stan, good morning. This has really been a very developing story over the weekend. What is the latest on this? Where are all of these protests taking place now?
Yeah, Madeline, how are you going? There have been protests across the country. Shanghai, we've seen big numbers. Wuhan as well. Of course, these protests grew out of Xinjiang, and there have been calls at all these protests to lift the lockdown in Xinjiang. Xinjiang, of course, in the western part of the country where the Uyghur Muslim population is. And, of course, China accused of committing a genocide against the Uyghurs, locking them up in detention centres or re-education camps that some have called concentration camps. Well, what we're seeing in these protests is an anger that's been brewing across China for a long time now, and that is against the severity of these lockdowns. We've all seen the images coming out of China throughout COVID of people being forcibly restrained, locked into their houses or apartments for weeks, even months on end, as China seeks to win what Xi Jinping has called the People's War. He sees this as a war against COVID, but it's also an indication of the Chinese Communist Party's attempt to control every aspect of life, even to bend nature, in this case, to its will. And now we're seeing this blowback in the images you're looking at there on the screen of people holding up placards, people raising their voices, even, Madeline, calling for Xi Jinping to go. So we are seeing this increasing tension, now looking to what the response will be, because we see in the past, of course, when you see these sorts of uprisings, when you see these gatherings, there is a swift and often very severe response from the authorities.
But Stan, up until this point, we haven't seen the full force necessarily on display of the Chinese state against these protesters yet, have we?
No, we haven't. And it's a fine line that China walks and the Chinese Communist Party walks when it comes to these sorts of protests. You know, we look at these and we think that they're unusual, that they're rare. They're actually not. A lot of estimates say that there are as many as 150 to 180,000 protests, over 500 a day across China. From my time living and working there over the decade that I was there, I was constantly reporting protests in Tibet, protests from Falun Gong, protests for democracy, protests against environmental degradation, against the economy. People are very angry and they're often out on the streets and they're not afraid to raise their voices. Of course, hanging over all of this is the images of Tiananmen Square, where we saw protests for day after day, week after week, month after month, until we saw the brutal, the violent crackdown in the Tiananmen massacre. But people have continued to come out in the streets in China, and they're often out protesting. It's interesting, Madeline, when you look at China, and the Chinese Communist Party in many ways lives in greater fear of domestic unrest than it does of international conflict. It spends more money on its internal security than it does its external defence. So it walks a very fine line. How do you maintain control, in Xi Jinping's words, harmony, and harmonise the society without also tipping it over the edge to create even more of a backlash?
Well, given the extent of this, the bravery of some of those people going out without masks, the explicit criticism of Xi Jinping, how worried do you think he will be about this latest wave?
Well, the Chinese Communist Party knows this, and Xi Jinping is a student of Chinese history. He knows that if the population rises up, it leads to catastrophic consequences. Chinese history over the past, particularly the past 150 years, you hear Xi Jinping often talk about the 100 years of humiliation. If you take the fall of the Qing Empire up to the 1949 Communist Party revolution, you see enormous conflict, the Boxer Rebellion, the Taiping Rebellion, the Civil War, enormous conflict with enormous death tolls. Tens of millions of people die. So Xi Jinping knows that for the Communist Party to maintain its centrality in the country, it has to be, on the one hand, offering the Chinese people a better life, offering them a greater economic security, but at the other hand, controlling these breakouts when people get angry and they take to the streets. And as you said, the bravery and the courage that we've seen of people who are going out on the street, not wearing masks, and calling for Xi Jinping to go. The Communist Party knows what happens when people rise up. That's what Chinese history tells them. But we also know that Xi Jinping has shown throughout the COVID the COVID pandemic, with crackdowns in Hong Kong, crackdowns in Xinjiang, the threats against Taiwan, the way he's able to use technology to monitor people's movements, that he has been able to crack down on these things and to silence dissent as well. And that's the hinge point we're at right now.
Well, we will very eagerly await and see. Thanks so much for your analysis this morning, Stan. Thanks.